Welcome back to the Resolution Room, where we turn tension into transformation through clarity, connection, and consistency. I'm your host, Dr. Nashay Lowe, and this is a space where we explore what's really underneath the moments that challenge us and how they can lead to something more honest, more human, and more whole. So let's get into it. This episode explores the topic of heritage preservation as more than saving old buildings or artifacts. It's about preserving memory, protecting identity, and navigating the politics of what gets remembered and what gets erased. Through a conversation with the heritage preservation specialist, Dr. Ann Chance, and what it means to keep the past while still making room for the future. So Ann, if you can start by introducing yourself and let everyone know who you are and what you do.
Hi, again, my name is Ann Chance. I have a PhD in international conflict management, peace building, and development. I have a master's degree in heritage preservation, and I worked for many years in heritage preservation. Few things drove me toward the conflict degree, and a lot of that had to do with conflict in preservation. And so here I am developing a way to approach preservation through trauma-informed restorative practices and using those practices with preservation to give a more broad view of what history is, what heritage is, and what culture is.
And that's perfect because my first question is, can you help us understand what heritage preservation is really all about?
Well, yeah, there's a few ways to look at this. Institutionally, it began with a group of ladies who were looking to preserve George Washington's Mount Vernon. Legally, in the U.S. anyway, it was codified in the 1966 National Heritage Preservation Act, most often referred to as Section 106. And it was mostly focusing on architectural history at the time for many years and is now taking on a broader view of what preservation is. Okay. Practically, heritage preservation happens when language, crafts, skills, objects, sites, stories, foodways, and other manifestations of culture are preserved for the future, and to which the public is given access. That's kind of an important part of it. Many people preserve things, collect things, but what is important about heritage preservation is it shows the public their history.
Amazing. And so can you talk a little bit more about how preserving a site, language, or story supports a community's sense of identity?
Yeah, this is kind of a double-edged sword.
Okay.
So on the one hand, and especially if the community is under duress of some kind, preserving things gives the community kind of a common touchstone, a way to say, we are together in this. On the other hand, if only one group in the community controls the narrative surrounding what is to be preserved, the community loses touch with one another, and one group reinforces their social dominance with legitimizing myths that are codified in the site or in interpretive narratives. But done right, it becomes the story of us and not the story of us and them. And this is where rooting out social dominance is really important.
Mm-hmm. And can you go a little deeper on what role heritage plays in people feeling seen?
Well, on the individual level, it connects you to the past in a personal way. It's as much about being seen as seeing yourself as part of the whole story. And it's about connection and relationship. And I'm going to give you an example of this, 2 examples actually. In our PhD program, we had a friend who was from Italy, and I am from Italian heritage. And one day he turns to me and he says, Ann, why is it that every time I talk to an Italian in this country, they want to talk about food? And I thought about it for a minute, and I realized it's really the only part of the Italian culture that we have left. When Italians came to this country, they wouldn't teach their children and their grandchildren the language. As far as I know, there's no Italian dances I was ever taught. And so, and any other cultural thing that they could have passed down. So the only thing that was passed down was the food and the food ways. And that was my explanation to him. Another example for me is my favorite museum in the whole U.S., the Museum of the City of New York. And I love this museum because anyone who has a connection to New York can see themselves in that museum. They do a beautiful job of showing every group that has come to that city and talking about their role in the city. And I would say that very few city museums really do that.
I'll have to put that on my list. So, when we're talking about heritage, it's often political, right? We're talking about who gets remembered and who gets erased. So, how do you navigate that tension in your work?
Well, like I said before, my approach to my work is rooted in trauma-informed restorative practices. There's key concepts that I try to keep front and center. And this was not innate to me. This is not something that I just knew how to do. It was part of a continuing journey toward inclusiveness of practice and inclusiveness of thought and what posture I would take as I approach these things. So I talked about social dominance before, and this is a really key concept because in social dominance, what happens is one group is set up as, well, we're the good people and everyone else is compared to us. And we can go out and make plenty of examples of this. And so everybody else comes up lacking toward that group, and that group takes the central narrative in most histories. Another aspect of trauma-informed restorative practices is historical awareness. Now, when they talk about it in terms of education, they're usually talking about a personal history of trauma. When I look at it, I am thinking about in history, what groups have experienced historical trauma? Well, again, we can probably name lots and lots of groups that have experienced that. And experiencing that as a group has an impact throughout generations. And as you may or may not know, one of the key aspects of restorative practices is that the victims in those cases, they want to be acknowledged. They want it to be acknowledged that these things have happened, and they want reparations for it. And I might digress a little here,
Okay.
but reparations is, a super touchy subject because in our very economically aware society, people think, well, reparations means money. But, sometimes reparations just means having your history told and told in a way that you are not compared to another group and found lacking, right? And the key thing with restorative practices is both groups talk and decide, how are we going to present this? And especially to have whatever group has been marginalized or erased say, well, this is the way we want our history portrayed. And to understand, and I'll probably hit on this several times, history is way bigger than we think it is. We have always been taught these very central narratives without thinking about how many other groups, people, events have shaped our whole history as humans. I'm going to jump back now to the postures and the thoughts that I try to keep in front of me. One of them is cultural humility. And for that, what that means is I am always looking at, am I looking at this through my lens? And if I am, how can I take that lens away and look at it through somebody else's lens. And sometimes that might just mean my saying, I can only see it this way. Can you tell it to me your way so that I can understand what you are seeing versus what I have been conditioned to see? And that is, I can't ever think that I should stop being reflexive on that, because it's so easy to slip back into whatever our cultural norms are. So I have to be vigilant, and I will fail sometimes, but I'm actually very lucky that I have friends that will hold me accountable, and I will listen to them.
Amazing. Yeah. So this is very thoughtful and an amazing approach to the work that you do. And it overlaps in so many other areas, because what I hear you saying is, you know, empathy and compassion underlines a lot of this work, right? In order to truly connect with different groups and their histories and understanding. When you got into this, did you think that that was going to be such a dominant part of the job, is just practicing empathy daily?
No, I honestly no. When I got into it, I was taught a very specific way of looking at things. Here's what the laws are, and I won't get deeply into this, but as we know, laws and other things have some systemic problems. I'll just leave it at that.
Uh,
Epistemic problems. But you are absolutely right to mention connectivity and relationships, because that's what our history is really about. You know, who who we are and how we are related to one another. And I don't mean to be provocative, but are no slaves without slave owners, right? There's a connection there. There's plenty of other examples of that. Uh,
mhm,
and then to go back to the initial law was so much more about architecture, right? And the significance of the architecture was firmly rooted in a socially dominant narrative, right?
mhm,
So it has taken time for people, and it is happening. I mean, I'm glad to say that more and more people, and I'm going to say especially the younger people, are learning to look at things differently because they have been raised differently and exposed to different things, different perspectives, and the things that are norms or were norms for older generations have been challenged, and people are more aware of that, and I think it's a good thing.
mhm. I, I agree. um, can you think of, in your experiences, your studies, your work, of an example of a conflict or controversy around preservation that really stuck with you?
Oh yeah, it's the one that pushed me into our degree, actually, the one that pushed me into the conflict management. And it's the one that won't go away in the US. And I was going to do my dissertation on that. But one of my committee members told me that by the time I finished, everything would have been written about the subject and my work would be passé. But as I was thinking about, coming here and talking to you, um, that really means that nobody's talking about it anymore and it hasn't gone away.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. And we touched on this a little bit earlier when we were talking about restorative practices. So, how do communities reclaim erased narratives through heritage work?
This is a great question. Um, the short answer, the short answer is gather it together and teach it to the next generation, right? That's where it falls short. They're not teaching it for a variety of reasons. And then you involve other groups, but you preserve the integrity of your heritage. And you don't let anyone but you and your community define who you are and how you came to be. And then you let go of any shame you might feel about your origins. I feel like legitimizing myths are born from shame on two levels. If they're from the socially dominant group, they know that they're eliminating or subjugating other groups. So they legitimize it. but there's shame attached to that.
Mm-hmm.
And they'd rather do that than acknowledge or make reparations for it. From the bottom up perspective, we forget that it is okay to have humble roots, especially when the group that's overcome harrowing traumatic experiences that they've experienced to establish themselves within the larger community.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Mm-hmm.
have a personal example of erasure of history due to shame, which is my grandfather was the wheelman on a armed bank robbery back in the, I want to say it was the 30s. And the city of New York sent my father the court case records. Well, my father was so ashamed, he burned them. Well, I have that generational distance between myself and my grandfather, whom I've never met. He died before I was born. And I would have loved to have read that court case. Do you know? Also, just in terms of reclaiming your erased narratives, don't accept token gestures from historical places like, oh, today's Latin America Day. And that's the one day that Latin Americans, visit the site. Come together as a group to require that the city and community historic places make room for your community, your culture, and your history. And I've heard things like, well, going back to Latin America, the Latin American Association covers that. Well, the problem is it's excluded from the broad narrative of the place and not given room in these institutions that schools, tourists, and even residents visit regularly. And if you don't see it, you don't know it, right?
I have a sort of a question that just kind of, while you were talking, hit me. So sorry if this is not a prepared
Nope,
statement.
that's fine.
Um, so I love everything you're saying about groups sort of taking control of celebrating their heritage and culture within their own communities. I guess the bigger picture, how do we sort of balance that celebration of different groups without losing the sort of interconnectedness of humanity as a whole?
Well, this is why, let's say a city museum. We'll go back to the city museum, the city of the Museum of New York. This is why museums need to carve out space for all the different cultural groups.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mean just ethnic. I mean even LGBTQ.
Mm-hmm.
Because all of our histories are combined. We are the collective of these histories. And whether we realize it or not, they impact our everyday lives. And so if they're excluded from sites, museums, even from archives, and that's a much deeper subject that I won't even go into, the information is not there to be had. And to go back to the beginning, people have to have access to the information. Not just the people in the specific community, but all people, because that's how you learn, right?
Exactly. And, thinking about the story you were telling about your grandfather, and I imagine plenty of families have similar stories of repressed histories. So, how can preserving the past help heal historical trauma or bridge intergenerational conflicts?
Well, when you have a trauma, right? Even though the next generation didn't experience that trauma, it informs how the parent reacts to things that the child is doing. But the child might have no knowledge of what happened. And so it seems like it's coming from nowhere. So even as difficult as these stories are, and they make us vulnerable when we talk about them, right? They're
Mhm.
hard to talk about. Passing the information along gives the context to where some of the family history is, some of the family practices are, and some of the, I'm going to say, family quirks that you might, and actually that's kind of glossing over. There might be There might be family anger that expresses itself a variety of ways. And this is because of the trauma that wasn't resolved.
Exactly. And so, what happens when we stop avoiding painful histories and start acknowledging them with care? Like, what does that look like?
Well, it has to be done in a safe place, right? For everybody. Um, it's hard to take responsibility for something that you may not think you're connected to, right? You have to understand that you have to have that historical awareness, not only of the other group, but of your own group, to understand how these different histories have impacted one another. And to go back to restorative practices, you have to acknowledge that a harm was done, right? You have to say that, yes, my culture has enacted this harm upon your culture. And then you have to find a way to make reparations. But the cool thing, I think, with restorative practices is that it's something that you do together. Like the group that's been victimized says, well, here's what we think is appropriate. They get to say that. This is what's appropriate for that. And the people whose group maybe perpetrated the harms can figure out a way that that can happen. And the key part of that is nobody's shaming anybody else, right? The the point is when you can, I'm going to cough, hold on. When you can realize and acknowledge this harm has happened and maybe give back to the other community, well, here's why it happened. There might have been extenuating circumstances, or when I'm going to go back to Confederate statute, to the Confederate issues. These are people who experienced trauma too, and they were in a war, and thousands of their men were killed. So they have their own trauma to deal with, and those are tied to the memorials. The key is that you're working together to figure out what's best for your community in this situation. You know, with Confederate statues and memorials, there's not two ways to handle it. That was probably the main reason I went into the conflict management program. And I was like, I know there's more than two ways to handle it. There are. And the key thing is the community affected all the way around. That might include the people who are just, who are not connected. Maybe they moved from New York down here, like me, or their families have been here since the 1700s, whatever. But you're living in the community. That's the group that makes the decisions.
Okay. And, as we wrap up, what do you hope people walk away with when they think about preservation, not just as a field, but as a practice?
Well, I think this is a place where we can start peace building by acknowledging our shared past, even if it's not pleasant or comfortable. That's a practice. We need to understand, I'll go back to this. We need to understand that our history is bigger than the singular narratives we've been taught and that currently exist in museums, sites, archives, and other repositories of history and culture. And this is a good thing, especially now that federal funding is kind of drying up for preservation. If you understand that your community is bigger than you think it is, then and you show that you are actually interested in having them visible on the site as a part of the history, then you've expanded the base of people who will support you from a very practical level. But in the end, we have to live together as a community and we have to understand each other. And these sites are places where we can do that.
Amazing. Thank you, Anne. Before, again, I let you go, can you let the audience know where to find you and follow your work?
Well, I could be found on LinkedIn, um, and very soon I will be starting my own nonprofit, and it's called the Legacies Peace Center. And we are going to be focusing on teaching women to be peace builders. I think historically women have been peace builders, but we want to bring women from the various groups, cultures, indigenous communities together, because among these women, there is a lot of wisdom, traditional wisdom, experience wisdom, and we're going to focus on food sovereignty, food cultures, and food ways as one of the programs. That's the one I'm interested in doing. But ultimately, it's about having sustainable futures and having women as active vocal members of bringing their community together.
Amazing, amazing. I can't wait to collaborate with you on that. Well, Dr. Chance reminded us that preservation is not just about the past, it's about what we carry forward. Whether it's tradition, a language, or a legacy, heritage connects us to belonging. And when that connection is threatened or erased, the conflict that emerges isn't just cultural, it's existential. And when we choose to protect what matters, we create room for healing, remembering, and building forward with intention. As always, thank you for joining me in the resolution room. If this conversation moved you, challenged you, or gave you something to carry forward, consider supporting the show. You can explore our wearable wisdom collection in our Mind Shop, where each piece is designed to spark reflection and dialogue. You can also join our growing community for behind the scenes conversations, resources, and support of your own journey through tension and transformation. And if you just want to say thank you in a simple way, you can always buy me a coffee. Every gesture helps keep this space going. All the links are in the show notes. And until next time, keep building in the quiet because that's what will carry you forward.